It begins with a sound, not a roar, not a scream, but a low frequency hum that vibrates in the marrow of your bones before it ever reaches your ears. I found myself standing in the rain-slicked remains of an abandoned textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, staring at a bricked-up archway that shouldn't have been there. The blueprints from 1894 show a solid foundation. The ground-penetrating radar shows a void, not a small void, a cavernous, engineered silence. We are told that history is a solid line, a sturdy staircase of progress where each step is built firmly upon the last. But what if the stairs are hollow? What if the ground we walk on is merely a scab, healed over a wound that refuses to close? Ask yourself why every major city in the Western world underwent a great fire between 1850 and 1920. Chicago, Boston, Seattle, London, San Francisco. They tell us it was kerosene lamps and wooden frames. They tell us it was progress demanding its due, but look closer at the ruins. Look at the photographs taken in the immediate aftermath. You will see red brick buildings with basement windows buried 6 feet below the new street level. You will see mud floods that the history books refuse to name. They didn't just rebuild these cities, they raised the floor. They buried the evidence of a global, interconnected architecture under millions of tons of dirt and paved over the truth with the mundane asphalt of the 20th century. This is not a conspiracy of shadows, it is a conspiracy of scale. We are talking about thousands of miles of subterranean tunnels, vaulted ceilings, and precision masonry that defies the primitive tools of the era. Why would a civilization with horse-drawn carriages build a transit system of such immense load distribution? Why are the finest examples of this lost architecture always found in the basements of post offices and courthouses? It is institutional gatekeeping on a tectonic scale. They didn't just seal the tunnels, they sealed the narrative. As I moved further into the damp, light-starved corridors of the Lowell site, I realized the masonry wasn't just old, it was wrong. The mortar density didn't match the colonial records. It felt more like a geopolymer, a synthetic stone that suggests a level of material science we are told didn't exist until the mid-20th century. I began to track this anomaly across the globe. I followed the thread to the Paris catacombs, where the official story claims the tunnels were merely limestone quarries repurposed to hold the dead. But if you stray from the tourist path, if you slip through the gates the authorities haven't checked in decades, you find something else. You find chambers that aren't shaped for mining. You find circular halls with acoustics so perfect they can carry a whisper 100 yards. This is not the work of desperate city planners trying to solve a graveyard overflow. This is a resonant system. I found similar structures in the buried levels of Moscow, under the heavy Stalinist concrete. There are maps from the 17th century that show a vast, unified territory labelled Tartaria. They tell us it was just a geographical term, a vague label for the uncivilized East. But look at the star forts. Look at the bastions that span from the coast of Florida to the heart of the Eurasian steppe. They are all built on the same geometric principles. They all sit atop these sealed underground systems. Ask yourself, why does a fort need to be shaped like a fractal? Why does it need a subterranean network that mirrors the stars above? Not for defense, not for storage, for something else. The erasure is total. We are taught to look at the sky and wonder about the stars, but we are forbidden from looking down. The ground beneath our feet is a lie. The deeper you go, the more the chronology begins to shatter. I spent weeks in the archives of the Smithsonian looking for records of the Grand Canyon expeditions of the early 1900s. There are newspaper clippings, real, tangible ink on a paper, that speak of Egyptian-style vaults found deep within the canyon walls. They speak of a great underground city that the government promptly sealed and declared a restricted zone. What if the civilization we call Tartaria wasn't just a nation, but a global power grid? Consider the World's Fairs of the late 1800s. These white cities were built with stunning complexity, shimmering with electric light at a time when most people were still using candles. And then, as if by a prearranged signal, they were all torn down, destroyed, burned. They tell us they were temporary structures made of steff, a mixture of plaster and hemp. But look at the photos. Look at the massive machinery, the fountains, the statues. You don't build a temporary city with the architectural permanence of a cathedral. You build a temporary city to mask a permanent discovery. They used the fairs as an excuse to excavate the buried Tartarian ruins, strip them of their technology, and then demolish the evidence under the guise of celebrating progress. It is a classic move of institutional erasure. Hide the old world by pretending it's a brand new miracle of the current one. The underground systems beneath these fairgrounds were never removed. They were simply capped. I have seen the manhole covers in Chicago that lead to nowhere. I have felt the heat rising from the vents in San Francisco where there should be no steam. What are they still running down there? What is the load distribution truly supporting? I tracked a lead to a contact in the mining industry who had worked on the expansion of the London Underground. He spoke of ghost stations that weren't on a map, but he also spoke of something more unsettling. He described walls that seemed to bleed a metallic sludge when drilled. He described chambers filled with rows of glass cylinders, each etched with a script that resembled no known language. When his team reported the find, they weren't congratulated, they were replaced. Within 48 hours, the site was backfilled with high-pressure concrete. This is the pattern: discovery, denial, burial. It happens in the dark, in the silence of the substrata. What if these tunnels weren't for people? What if they were for power? The Tartarian architecture is obsessed with atmospheric electricity. The spires, the domes, the metal finials, they look like antennas. And the underground that is the grounding wire, a global circuit carved into the very crust of the earth. Ask yourself, why was Nikola Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower destroyed? Why was he obsessed with the idea of free energy being pulled from the ground? He wasn't inventing something new, he was trying to reactivate something old, something that had been sealed. The institutional gatekeepers couldn't allow a world where energy was as free as air. They needed a world of meters and bills. They needed a world where we were disconnected from the pulse of the planet. So they buried the circuit. They turned the cathedrals into museums and the power plants into ruins. In the 4th month of my investigation, I found myself in the salt mines of Romania. There is a specific depth where the air changes. It becomes dry, ionized, and strangely metallic. My guide, a man who had spent 40 years in the dark, pointed to a section of the wall where the salt had been cut with a precision that modern drills cannot replicate. "This was here before the mine," he whispered. "We just found it." He showed me a doorway that led into a shaft plunging straight down, deeper than any known mining operation. He claimed that on quiet nights you can hear a rhythmic thumping from below, a heartbeat of machinery that hasn't stopped for centuries. This is the unresolved philosophical open loop. If the system is still running, who is it serving? It's not us. We are the surface dwellers, the ants scurrying across the top of a motherboard. We don't understand. The Tartarian system wasn't just about tunnels and trains. It was about the management of the Earth's frequency. They had mastered the art of sympathetic resonance. By building their cities on specific ley lines and connecting them with these deep underground conduits, they could stabilize the climate, enhance crop yields, and perhaps even extend human life. This is why the erasure had to be so complete. To steal a man's money is a crime. To steal his history is a lobotomy. We have been collectively lobotomized. We look at the ruins of the ancients and see primitive people with hammers and chisels. We don't see the masters of the electromagnetic spectrum. We don't see the giants whose basements we are currently inhabiting. I began to look at the old world maps again, but this time with a cynical eye. I noticed that the borders of Tartaria didn't just fade away, they were scrubbed. In the late 18th century, the maps show a massive empire. By the mid-19th, it is a series of unexplored territories. This is the Great Reset, not a digital one, but a physical one. They used the underground systems to move vast amounts of material, perhaps even to relocate entire populations. Look at the orphan trains of the late 1800s. Thousands upon thousands of children shipped across America to populate the newly discovered lands. Where did they come from? Why were there so many? The official record says they were the children of poor immigrants in New York. But what if they were the survivors of a dismantled civilization? What if they were the re-education project of the New World Order? They were placed in the repurposed Tartarian buildings, the asylums, the schools, the orphanages, and told that their history began with the steam engine. They were taught to forget the tunnels beneath their feet. They were taught that the buried windows were just a style or a drainage solution. It is a terrifying thought that our great-grandparents were the victims of a global gaslighting campaign, and we are the heirs to their amnesia. The urban exploration narrative always leads to the same wall. You find a door, you find a tunnel, and then you find the concrete plug. The authorities don't even hide the plugs anymore. They know we won't ask why. Consider the deep state in a literal sense, not as a political cabal, but as a physical location. If you wanted to control a planet, would you stay on the surface where you are vulnerable to the elements and the eyes of the masses? Or would you move into the pre-existing, indestructible, climate-controlled infrastructure of the Tartarians? There are reports from whistleblowers in the military who speak of continuity of government facilities that are vast enough to house tens of thousands of people for decades. They call them DUMBs, deep underground military bases. But they didn't build them. They found them. They renovated them. They installed modern lighting and server racks, but the bones of the structure, the load distribution, the vaulted archways are Tartarian. They are living in the ruins of the empire they destroyed. It's a parasitic relationship. The modern world is a skin graft over a body it doesn't belong to. Every time a new subway line is proposed and then mysteriously delayed or rerouted, ask yourself what they hit. Every time a historic building is demolished, despite public outcry, ask yourself what was in the basement. They aren't destroying the building. They are sealing the access point. They are keeping us on the surface, in the light, where we are easy to manage. But the hum is still there. It vibrates in the silence of the night, a reminder that something is still functioning deep in the dark. I travelled to the deserts of Uzbekistan, following a lead about a lost city that had been visible on the satellite imagery for 1 week before being blurred out by the providers. When I arrived, the area was cordoned off by environmental researchers. But the wind carries more than sand. It carries the smell of ozone. I found a local who remembered the days before the fences. He told me of the glass floors. He said that if you dig deep enough in the dunes, you don't find water. You find a sheet of translucent material that stretches for miles. He said that if you look through the glass, you can see lights moving below. Not electric lights, but a glowing bioluminescent pulse. This fits the Tartarian pattern. They didn't just use the underground for transit, they used it for life. They had created a synthetic sun, a way to harness the Earth's core temperature to provide light and warmth. This is the forbidden knowledge. We are told that we are a type 0 civilization, dependent on burning dead plants for energy. But we were once type 1. We once had a global, sustainable and free energy system, and they took it from us. They sealed the vents, they flooded the shafts, they turned the world into a series of isolated islands, connected only by the expensive and fragile infrastructure they control. Not this, not that. Something else, something so much bigger than a political ideology. The staccato rhythm of the construction crews outside my window in New York sounds like a funeral march. They are retrofitting the old pipes. That's what the sign says. But the pipes they are pulling out are copper-lined, 6 inches thick, and etched with the same geometric patterns I saw in Romania. These aren't water pipes. They are waveguides. They are part of the grid. I watched from a distance as they loaded them into unmarked trucks. They didn't go to a scrapyard. They went to a secure facility in New Jersey. They are harvesting the old world to power the new one, even as they tell us the old world never existed. It is a slow motion looting of a corpse. The skepticism of authority isn't just a healthy habit, it's a survival mechanism. If they can lie about the ground you stand on, they can lie about anything. They can lie about the air you breathe, the food you eat, and the thoughts you have. The investigative essayist's job isn't to provide answers, it's to identify the erasure, to point at the blank spots on the map and say, something was here. The somber reality is that we may never get back what was lost. The tunnels are too deep, the concrete is too thick, the amnesia is too profound. We end where we began, with the hum. In the basement of that mill in Lowell, I put my ear against the bricked up archway. I didn't hear the wind. I didn't hear the city. I heard a low, rhythmic throb. It sounded like a heart, or a pump, or a generator. It was the sound of a system that refused to die, even after it was buried alive. What if the Great Reset isn't something that happened in the past, but something that is happening now? What if the sealing of the underground is a preparation for something else? Ask yourself why the world's billionaires are all building bunkers at the same time. They aren't building bunkers. They are securing their spots in the Tartarian system before the surface becomes uninhabitable. They are moving back into the veins of the earth, and they are leaving us up here on the scab, wondering why the stairs are hollow. The mystery isn't what happened to Tartaria. The mystery is why we are still pretending it didn't. The investigation doesn't end here. It can't. Every brick you see, every manhole you pass, every historical marker you read, it's all a part of the veil. Look for the buried windows, listen for the hum. And when you find the door that shouldn't be there, don't walk away. Ask yourself, what are they so afraid of us finding? The truth isn't out there, it's down there, and it's waiting. The vibration in the brickwork is not a mechanical byproduct. It is a signature. I returned to the Lowell site at 3 a.m, equipped with a contact microphone and a digital recorder capable of capturing subsonic frequencies. What I recorded was not the random rattling of a decaying infrastructure. It was a sequence, a mathematical progression that repeated every 84 minutes. The waveform showed a series of spikes followed by a long, tapering decay, mirroring the exact signature of a piezoelectric discharge. I began to correlate this data with seismic readings from other Great Reset cities. In Seattle, beneath the Pioneer Square district, where the city was literally razed one story after the 1889 fire, the same 84-minute pulse exists. In the catacombs of Odessa, where thousands of miles of unmapped tunnels snake through the limestone, the pulse is even stronger. This is not a coincidence of urban planning. This is a synchronized heartbeat. Ask yourself, why does an abandoned tunnel system need a heartbeat? Not for ventilation, not for drainage, for something else. The institutional response to these readings is always a variation of the same dismissal: ambient, urban noise, or subway resonance. But the subways aren't running at 3 a.m. in Odessa. The sewers don't pulse with Fibonacci sequences. We are looking at a planetary scale machine that is still under tension, a coiled spring of ancient engineering that the modern world has simply paved over because they couldn't figure out how to turn it off. I took the recordings to a retired structural engineer who had spent his career working on deep bore projects for the Department of Energy. He looked at the frequency analysis and turned pale. He didn't talk about pipes or pumps. He talked about load distribution in a vacuum. He suggested that the vaulted masonry I had seen wasn't designed to support the weight of the buildings above, but to contain an internal pressure from below. The red brick, the geopolymer mortar, the arched geometry, it was a containment vessel. According to his theory, the Tartarian underground was a pressurized gas or plasma distribution network. This explains the Great Fires. When you compromise a pressurized system of that magnitude, you don't just get a leak, you get an inferno that can melt stone. The fires weren't the cause of the urban destruction. They were the catastrophic failure of the old world's power grid. The rebuilding that followed was actually a massive capping operation. They filled the ruptured lines with rubble, raised the street levels to bury the charred remains of the distribution hubs, and transitioned the global population to a less efficient, more controllable form of energy. They traded a mountain of fire for a desert of wires. It was the ultimate bait and switch. They gave us the light bulb and took away the sun. The erasure trope is most visible in our cemeteries. Have you ever noticed how many 19th century graveyards are built on high ground, often featuring massive, ornate mausoleums that look like miniature Greek temples? I visited the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, a place often cited as a masterpiece of rural cemetery design. But look at the foundations. The oldest tombs are not built into the hills were built around them. Excavation records from the 1840s show that workers levelled the terrain, which is institutional code for burying the previous layer of architecture. I found a series of ventilation grates hidden in the Victorian stonework near the Gothic arch entrance. They don't lead to a crypt. They lead to a vertical shaft that drops 60 feet into a circular chamber lined with a conductive copper alloy. This is the Tartarian aesthetic, functional machinery disguised as funerary art. By labelling these sites as hallowed ground, the gatekeepers ensured that no one would ever dig them up. It is a brilliant form of psychological cloaking. You don't hide your most important infrastructure in a fortress, you hide it in a graveyard. No one asks questions about a hole in the ground if there's a headstone on top of it. What if the dead we are honouring are actually the discarded components of a civilization we were never supposed to remember? The deeper I dug into the records of the orphan trains, the more the sombre reality set in. These children weren't just displaced, they were reset. In the mid-1800s, there was a sudden global surge in foundling hospitals and industrial schools. In New York alone, the Children's Aid Society moved over 200,000 children to the West. At the same time, similar movements were happening in Russia, England, and Australia. These children were being sent to new cities that already had fully functional, sophisticated underground infrastructures. They were the blank slates. They were given new names, new histories, and taught a simplified version of reality that included the miracle of the steam engine and the glory of the colonial empire. They were the labour force used to dig out the buried first floors of the Tartarian buildings, told they were simply renovating the basements of their forefathers. They didn't know they were unearthing their own stolen heritage. Ask yourself, if you wanted to erase a global culture, wouldn't you start by separating the children from the survivors? Wouldn't you tell them that the grand buildings they lived in were built by their own primitive ancestors with nothing but hammers and pulleys? It is the most effective form of colonization, colonizing the timeline itself. I tracked a specific architectural anomaly across 3 continents, the sunken cathedral. From the salt cathedral of Zipaquirá in Colombia to the underground basilicas of Ethiopia and the buried chapels of Poland, the pattern is identical. These are not excavations, they are reclaimed spaces. The technical terms used in their descriptions, vaulted spans, buttress load distribution, hydrostatic equilibrium, betray a level of engineering that surpasses the surface level cathedrals of the same era. In Ethiopia, the rock-cut churches of Lalibela are said to have been carved by angels in a single night. This is the institutional erasure at work. When science cannot explain the scale of the achievement, it invokes the supernatural. I spoke with a geologist who had analysed the tool marks on the Lalibela walls. He noted that the precision was consistent with high-frequency ultrasonic cutting. There were no chisel marks, no signs of manual labour, just a smooth molecular separation of the basalt. He was silenced shortly after our meeting, his research grant rescinded for budgetary reasons. This is the gatekeeping. They don't just hide the evidence, they starve the investigators. They want us to believe in angels because believing in a superior human past is too dangerous for the current power structure. What if the mud flood wasn't a natural disaster, but a weaponized event? If the Tartarian system was based on atmospheric energy and pressure, then a deliberate disruption of the grid could trigger a liquefaction of the soil. I began researching the Great Reset period for evidence of localized soil liquefaction. I found reports from 1812, the year of the massive New Madrid earthquakes, describing sand blows and earth waves that swallowed entire towns. This was the same period as the Napoleonic Wars, a conflict that many revisionist historians now believe was the final military push to dismantle the Tartarian capital in the east. While the armies fought on the surface, the infrastructure was being sabotaged from below. The result was a global environmental collapse. The atmosphere thickened with dust. leading to the year without a summer in 1816. The mud didn't just fall from the sky, it surged up from the compromised underground conduits. It buried the first floors of the world's cities in a matter of weeks. The survivors didn't have the resources to dig it all out. They simply built new doors on the second floors and called it progress. The buried windows we see today are the scars of a planetary execution. I found a map in A's private collection in Geneva that dates back to 1780. It shows the Arctic not as a frozen wasteland, but as a series of 4 large islands surrounding a central mountain, the Rupas Nigra. The map shows a series of tunnels originating from this central point and radiating out like spokes on a wheel, connecting to the major cities of Tartaria. The map labels these tunnels as the breath of the world. This suggests that the underground system wasn't just for power or transport. It was a global ventilation and climate control system. By drawing cold air from the poles and circulating it through the subterranean network, the Tartarians could regulate the temperature of the entire planet. This explains why the old world architecture features such massive fireplaces that often lack chimneys or show no signs of soot. They weren't burning wood, they were tapping into the thermal distribution of the breath. When the system was sabotaged, the climate spiraled out of control. The Arctic froze, the deserts expanded. We were left with a broken thermostat and a ruling class that sells us the cure in the form of carbon taxes. Not this, not that, something else. A deliberate breaking of the world's lungs. The skepticism of the academic elite is the final layer of the seal. I attended a lecture on subterranean urbanism at a prestigious university in London. The professor spoke at length about the evolution of the London sewer system, praising the foresight of Joseph Bazalgette. When I asked about the pre-existing brickwork that Bazalgette incorporated into his designs, specifically the arched tunnels that predate the Great Fire, he laughed. He called it architectural recycling and moved on to the next slide. This is the pseudo-academic language used to hand-wave away the impossible. Recycling implies a level of convenience, but you don't recycle a 500-mile network of precision masonry unless you're trying to hide the fact that you couldn't build it yourself. The sheer volume of red brick used in the 19th century is statistically impossible. There weren't enough brick kilns in the world to produce the billions of bricks required for the London sewers, the New York subways, and the Chicago foundations in the timeframes provided by the official history. Where did the bricks come from? They were already there. They were part of the Tartarian shell. The builders of the 19th century were actually just the unearthers. They were the clean-up crew. In the shadows of the unresolved, I found a pattern of institutional erasure involving the world's most famous libraries, the Library of Alexandria, the Library of Ivan the Terrible, the countless archives destroyed during the Great Fires. They tell us it is a tragedy of lost knowledge. I think it is a strategy of controlled knowledge. They didn't burn the books, they moved them. I suspect the true archives of the Tartarian system are located within the very tunnels they sealed. There are rumours of a Vatican beneath the Vatican, a library that extends miles into the earth, containing the technical manuals for the world we lost. If you have the manuals, you have the power. If the rest of us are kept in a state of intellectual provocative darkness, we will never think to look for the switch. We will continue to pay for the energy that should be free. We will continue to live in the modern world, unaware that we are just squatters in a palace. The staccato beat of my own heart matches the pulse of the Lowell site now. I can't unhear it. I can't unsee the buried windows. I am no longer just an investigator. I am a witness to a crime that spans centuries. Ask yourself what happens when the tension in the system finally breaks. The 84-minute pulse is getting stronger. The sinkholes appearing in major cities are becoming more frequent. The concrete plugs are cracking. The institutional gatekeepers are scrambling to pass infrastructure bills that are actually just desperate attempts to patch a leaking motherboard. What if the end of the world isn't a future event, but the final failure of the Tartarian system we've been parasitizing? What if the forbidden knowledge isn't just about the past, but about the immediate survival of our species? The investigation invites you to look down, to question the pavement, to wonder why the basement of your apartment building has a vaulted ceiling and a bricked-up archway that points toward the center of the city. The script is written in the stone, in the load distribution, and in the silence of the archives. We are the architects of our own amnesia, but the ground remembers. The underground system is still there. It is sealed, but it is breathing, and eventually every seal breaks. The narrative is a circle. The beginning is the end. The truth is heavy, and it is sinking. Would you like me to continue with the next sections of the investigation? The resonance I captured in Lowell was only the beginning of a much larger, more disturbing acoustic map. I began to cross-reference these subsonic pulses with the locations of obsolete star forts, those massive, geometrically perfect stone bastions that are scattered across every continent, from Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas to the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg. The design is identical, a fractal star, a masterpiece of load distribution, and almost always sitting atop a massive subterranean void. Official history claims these were defensive structures designed to deflect cannon fire. Ask yourself, why would a defensive structure require such intricate mirrored symmetry that can only be appreciated from the air? Why would a fort in the middle of a desert need a foundation that extends hundreds of feet into the bedrock? Not for defense, not for war, for something else. These forts are the nodes. They are the physical interfaces where the underground system connects with the atmospheric grid. When I placed my sensors on the limestone walls of Fort Portange, I didn't find the silence of a museum. I found the same 84-minute heartbeat. The forts were never meant to keep people out. They were meant to keep the energy in. They are the capacitors of the old world. The institutional gatekeepers have been remarkably thorough in their erasure of the star fort's true function. They call it trace Italian architecture, a fancy term to distract from the fact that these structures exist in places where Italian influence never reached. They exist in Japan, in South Africa, in the heart of the American Midwest. They are part of a global, unified technological layer. If you look at the layout of a star fort from above, it doesn't look like a castle. It looks like a circuit board. It looks like a resonance chamber. I began to realize that the moats surrounding these forts weren't filled with water for protection. They were filled with water to act as a conductive medium. Water is a memory, a carrier of frequency. The underground systems beneath the forts would use the water to stabilize the oscillations of the Earth's crust. It was a terraforming project of a scale we can barely conceive, but the history books tell us they were just expensive, impractical forts that were quickly rendered obsolete by the invention of better cannons. It's a convenient lie. You don't build a global fractal network just to be defeated by a bigger ball of lead. You build it because it is the backbone of your civilization. And when that civilization is overthrown, the new masters must tell you the backbone was just a decorative rib. The skeptical investigator must ask, If the system was global, where was the capital? The maps of the 17th century point consistently to a region in northern Asia labelled Grand Tartaria. This was the seat of the power grid, but if you look at modern satellite imagery of that region, you see a strange mottled landscape. You see natural depressions that look suspiciously like collapsed tunnel systems. You see forests that are only 200 years old, growing over soil that is poisoned with high levels of radiation. There is a growing body of evidence suggesting that the final fall of Tartaria wasn't just a political collapse, but a thermal event, a scorched earth policy carried out with weapons that left the ground scarred and the history books blank. The underground systems were the only things that survived, protected by miles of stone and earth. The survivors fled into the depths. This is why we find buried cities all over Turkey. Derinkuyu, Kaymakli, massive underground complexes that could house 20,000 people. They tell us these were hiding spots for early Christians, but the ventilation shafts are too perfect. The load distribution is too sophisticated. These weren't hiding spots. They were the bunkers for the elite who knew the surface was about to burn. As I moved my investigation to the Great Reset cities of Europe, I found a recurring architectural trope, the oversized cathedral organ. We are told these are musical instruments designed to praise a deity. But look at the pipes. Look at the way they are integrated into the very structure of the building, often connecting directly to the underground vaults. A pipe organ is a pressure distribution device. It is a resonance generator. If the Tartarian system was based on frequency and atmospheric energy, then the cathedrals were the substations. They were the places where the raw energy of the earth was stepped down into a frequency that was beneficial for the human nervous system. This is why you feel a sense of awe when you enter a Gothic cathedral. It's not just the height, it's the vibration. The organs were the tuning forks for the city. When the New World Order took over, they didn't destroy the cathedrals. They couldn't. They were too useful. Instead, they repurposed them. They turned the power plants into churches and the resonance generators into musical toys. They kept the buildings, but they cut the cord. The staccato rhythm of my research led me to the concept of the erasure of the giants. In almost every culture, there are legends of a race of large humans who built the old world. In the late 19th century, American newspapers were filled with reports of massive skeletons being unearthed by farmers and construction crews, 7, 8, 9 feet tall. These skeletons were almost always found in proximity to the mounds and the underground tunnel entrances. And then the pattern repeated. The Smithsonian Institution would arrive, collect the remains for further study, and they would never be seen again. This is institutional gatekeeping at its most literal. If you want to maintain the narrative that humanity has always been on a slow, upward climb from the caves, you cannot have evidence of a superior, larger, more capable predecessor. You have to disappear the bones. You have to hide the fact that the doorways in the Tartarian buildings were 10 feet high because the people who lived in them were 10 feet tall. We are the small successors, living in a world built for giants, wondering why the ceilings are so high and the stairs are so steep. I interviewed an urban explorer in Berlin who had spent years mapping the U-Bahn extensions that the government refuses to acknowledge. He told me about the red rooms. Deep below the modern tracks, he found chambers where the walls were made of a translucent red glass that hummed with a static charge. He described how the air in these rooms didn't move, yet it felt charged with a heavy metallic scent. This is the load distribution of a different kind, not of stone, but of energy. The red rooms are the capacitors. They are the storage units for the atmospheric electricity that the star forts collected and the cathedrals refined. When I asked him why he stopped his explorations, he showed me a scar on his forearm that looked like a perfect geometric burn. He didn't get it from a fire. He got it from touching a wall that shouldn't have been powered. This is the forbidden knowledge in its most physical form. The system is still hot. It is a live wire buried in the mud of our ignorance, and the institutional gatekeepers are the only ones with the insulated gloves. Ask yourself why the Great Reset of the 19th century coincided with the rise of the patent office. Suddenly, every natural phenomenon was being invented and owned by a handful of men. Edison didn't invent the light, he patented the meter. The Tartarian system was a commons. It was a global utility that belonged to the earth and its inhabitants. The transition to the modern era was the privatization of existence. They took the underground conduits and turned them into sewers and subways so they could charge us for the privilege of moving through our own history. They took the atmospheric antennas and turned them into monuments so we would look at them with awe instead of utility. It is a somber, intellectual, provocative realization. We are paying a subscription fee to live in a house we already owned. The staccato rhythm of the utility bills is the heartbeat of our enslavement. I found a series of photographs from the 1906 San Francisco earthquake that were never published in the mainstream press. They don't show fallen wooden houses. They show the street level torn open, revealing massive vaulted brick tunnels that look like they belong in ancient Rome. But these tunnels were filled with charred machinery, huge copper-wound rotors and ceramic insulators that were melted into slag. This was the true cause of the fire that followed the quake. The earthquake didn't just shake the buildings, it short-circuited the city. San Francisco wasn't a pioneer town of the Wild West. It was a repurposed Tartarian hub. The reconstruction was a cover-up. They cleared the debris, the technology, and built a wooden city on top of the stone one, ensuring that the next time the system flared up, the evidence would be easier to burn. They are skeptical of our memory, so they keep the cycles of destruction short. The narrative structure of our world is a pattern-based investigation into erasure. Begin with the anomaly of the buried window. Expand into the global pattern of the star fort. Identify the institutional erasure of the great fires. End with the unresolved philosophical open loop. If we are the inheritors of a broken machine, do we even have the right to fix it? Or are we merely the maintenance crew for a power structure that resides in the deep, unmapped levels? I stood on the edge of the Grand Canyon, looking at the forbidden zones where the Smithsonian once found the vaults. The wind there doesn't whistle, it moans. It sounds like a flute with too many holes. It is the sound of the earth breathing through a system that has been choked with concrete. Not this, not that, something else. The underground system beneath Tartaria was not a secret. It was the foundation of reality. We are the ones living in the secret. We are the ones living in the dark, pretending the sun of the electric grid is the only light we've ever known. The staccato sentence structure of our modern lives, work, consume, sleep, repeat, is designed to keep us from hearing the 84-minute pulse. But the pulse is there. It is in the bricks of Lowell. It is in the mud of Chicago. It is in the red glass of Berlin. The investigation doesn't end because the evidence is everywhere. You just have to be willing to look down. You have to be willing to ask, what if the ground is a roof? And once you see the roof, you can never go back to believing in the floor. The final part of the script is not written in words, but in the silence that follows the question. Would you like me to continue with the next sections of the investigation? The investigation. of the red glass leads directly to the Grand Exposition era, where the load distribution of global energy was hidden behind the spectacle of temporary architecture. Between 1851 and 1915, the world was treated to a series of impossible cities: the Crystal Palace in London, the Trocadero in Paris, the Court of Honor in Chicago. They tell us these were built of lath and plaster. They tell us they were torn down because they were fire hazards. Ask yourself, how do you build a 200-foot dome of plaster that supports a 10-ton bronze statue? How do you wire a city for millions of incandescent bulbs in 1893 when the local power plant can barely light a city block? Not this, not that, something else. The World's Fairs were not celebrations of the future. They were the controlled demolitions of the past. They were liquidation sales of the Tartarian infrastructure. The massive lagoons were the cooling basins for the subterranean reactors. The palaces of industry were the original housing for the atmospheric harvesters. Once the public had been sufficiently dazzled, and once the specialised components had been stripped and moved to private research facilities, the cities were burned or bulldozed. The institutional erasure was disguised as a change in fashion. We were told the Victorian style was cluttered and that modernism was the future. Modernism is the architecture of the void. It is the architecture of people who have forgotten how to breathe with the earth. I followed the trail of the stripped components to the high deserts of New Mexico. There is a facility there, unremarkable from the surface, that sits atop a pre-Columbian star fort. The local legends speak of the blue light that rises from the ground during the summer solstice. This is not a military experiment, it is a maintenance cycle. The 84-minute pulse I recorded in Lowell is synchronized with the discharge of these desert nodes. I spoke with a former logistics officer who handled anomalous salvage in the 1970s. He described crates marked with the double-headed eagle, the crest of the Tartarian Empire, filled with mercury-based gyroscopes and heavy gold-plated resonators. These weren't artifacts, they were spare parts. The deep state is not a metaphor. It is a literal subterranean occupation of the Tartarian grid. They didn't invent the internet, they reactivated the lithospheric data layer. They didn't invent satellite communication. They tapped into the atmospheric ion channels that the star forts were designed to modulate. We are living in a stolen reality, using the crumbs of a feast we weren't invited to. The skepticism of the investigator is the only lantern in this tunnel. Consider the Great Wall of China. Modern revisionist historians have pointed out that the loopholes, the openings for archers, face inward toward China, not outward toward the invaders. This suggests the wall was not built by the Chinese to keep people out, but by the Tartarians to keep a specific population in, or perhaps it wasn't a wall at all. Look at the masonry. Look at the load distribution along the mountain ridges. It is a massive linear conductor. It is a long-wave antenna that spans a continent. The institutional gatekeepers tell us it was built over centuries by millions of peasants, but the geological consistency of the stone suggests a single, massive production run. It is a geopolymer circuit. When you connect the Great Wall to the star forts of the steppe and the underground systems of the Siberian basins, you don't get a defense perimeter. You get a planetary scale communication array. They didn't just build, they sang to the stone. They used frequency to bind the atoms. This is why the old world ruins never seem to crumble. They are molecularly bonded in a way our modern concrete can never achieve. The sombre truth of the mud flood becomes clearer when you examine the asylums of the late 19th century. Why did every state in the Union suddenly need a massive palatial lunatic asylum with thousands of beds and hydrotherapy wings? Look at the Danvers State Hospital or the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. These are not hospitals. They are repurposed Tartarian administrative hubs. The patients were the dissidents, the survivors of the old world who refused to accept the new narrative. If you remembered the tunnels, you were delusional. If you spoke of the free energy, you were manic. They used the subterranean levels of these asylums to treat the memory out of the population. Lobotomies, electroshock, isolation. It was a factory for amnesia. They took the people who knew how the world worked and turned them into ghosts. The hydrotherapy was a mockery of the original resonant water systems that once healed the body. Now, the water was just a tool for torture. The erasure is not just in the books, it is in the bloodline. We are the descendants of the survivors who learned to keep their mouths shut. I found a document in a restricted archive in Vienna that described the levelling of the peaks. It was a plan from the 1820s to systematically destroy the mountaintop monasteries of Tibet and the Andes. These weren't religious retreats. They were high-altitude relay stations. By destroying the peaks, the New World Order broke the long-distance capability of the Tartarian grid. They forced the energy back into the ground where it could be metered and controlled. The unresolved question is, what happened to the energy that couldn't be contained? It is still there, building up pressure. The earthquakes we experience today are often just the system burping, releasing a burst of stored atmospheric potential that has nowhere to go. We are living on a pressure cooker, and the institutional gatekeepers are sitting on the lid, telling us the whistling sound is just the wind. The staccato rhythm of the investigation now leads to the final seal. In the year 2029, the Global Broadband Initiative aims to cover every square inch of the planet in a high-frequency electromagnetic blanket. They tell us it's for connectivity. But look at the placement of the towers. They are being built directly over the Starfort nodes. They are being built over the buried red rooms. They aren't connecting us to the internet. They are jamming the Tartarian heartbeat. They are creating a layer of electronic noise so thick that we will never be able to hear the 84-minute pulse again. It is the final layer of the lobotomy. Once the blanket is complete, the forbidden knowledge will be inaccessible, not because it's hidden, but because we will have lost the sensory capacity to perceive it. We will be fully integrated into the synthetic grid, forever disconnected from the lithospheric reality. As I sit in this darkened room, listening to the hum of my own computer, I realize that even this technology is a trap. It is a tether. The investigator's role is to identify the erasure trope before the erasure is complete. We are in the final seconds of the countdown. The underground system is still there, beneath the asphalt, beneath the lies, beneath the Great Reset. It is a silent witness to a crime that has no statute of limitations. Ask yourself, if you could reach down and turn the switch back on, would you? Or are you too afraid of what the light might reveal? The architecture is waiting. The resonance is building. The load distribution is shifting, and the ground is getting hungry. The philosophical open loop remains. If Tartaria was so advanced, how did they lose? Perhaps they didn't. Perhaps the reset was their own choice. a withdrawal from a surface world that had become too volatile. Perhaps they are still down there, watching us stumble through their basements, waiting for us to grow up, or waiting for us to go extinct. The staccato beat of the clock is not just measuring time, it's measuring our ignorance. Not this, not that, something else. The story doesn't end with a period. It ends with a question mark carved into the stone of a buried foundation. I have mapped 10 cities. I have recorded 1,000 hours of subsonics. I have seen the glass floors and the red glass and the buried giants. The pattern is a circle. The investigation is a spiral. We are coming back to the center. The center is the underground system, and it is the only thing that is real. Everything else, the politics, the wars, the progress, is just the flickering of a shadow play on the wall of a cave. The investigative essayist can only point at the shadows. It is up to you to turn around and see the fire. The truth is somber. The truth is unsettling. But the truth is the only way out of the basement. The investigation ends here, not because the mystery is solved, but because the evidence has become too heavy to carry. The next step is not mine to take, it is yours. When you walk out of your house tomorrow, don't look at the sky. Look at the curb, look at the bricks, look at the way the ground slopes toward the old part of town, and ask yourself, what is breathing under my feet? The answer is there. It has always been there, sealed but not silent, waiting for the next reset. The investigation into the blue light and the New Mexico nodes brought me to a realization that is as technical as it is terrifying. The load distribution of the global narrative is not held up by facts, but by the sheer mass of the concrete poured into the Tartarian past. I spent 48 hours outside the perimeter of the dull space, monitoring the spectral output of the soil. What I found was a harmonic signature that matched the cathedral organs of Europe. Not a similarity, an identity. This suggests that the entire planet was once tuned to a single frequency, a global A, that kept the human consciousness in a state of coherent resonance. The institutional erasure of this frequency is the true crime of the 19th century. They didn't just steal our history, they detuned our souls. They replaced the organic resonance of the earth with the 60 hertz hum of the power grid, a frequency that induces anxiety, compliance, and spiritual fragmentation. Ask yourself, why are that standard pitch of music regulated by international bodies? Why was it changed in the early 20th century from the mathematically natural 432 Hz to the disharmonious 440 Hz? It is the final layer of the seal. By altering the frequency of our culture, they ensured we would no longer be in tune with the underground system. The star forts, the cathedrals, the red glass chambers, they all function on the old math. To us, they are just silent stone. To the Tartarians, they were singing. This is the forbidden knowledge that the skeptics of authority are finally beginning to hum. We are living in a world of static, wondering why we feel so disconnected from the ground we walk on. I found a map of the old world ley lines that intersects perfectly with the modern fibre optic backbone. They didn't lay the cables where they were needed. They laid them where the energy was already flowing. They are parasitizing the ghost of a superior network. The staccato rhythm of the digital age is just a mask for the deep, slow pulse of the Tartarian lithosphere. The Great Reset was a reboot into a restricted mode. We are the users with limited permissions staring at a file not found error whenever we look too deeply into the foundations of our cities. Not this, not that, something else. a reality that is vibrating just beneath the threshold of our suppressed senses. The somber reality is that the underground system is not a tomb, it is an engine. And like any engine that has been capped while still running, the pressure is reaching a critical point. The sinkholes are not geological accidents, they are blow-off valves. The institutional gatekeepers are running out of concrete. The investigative essayists' final task is to document the rupture. We are standing on the lid of a gargantuan pressure cooker, and the whistle is beginning to scream. Ask yourself, when the lid finally flies off, will you be standing on the side of the people who hid the truth, or will you be ready to finally hear the song of the earth? The script is finished, the pulse is steady, the ground is waiting.